He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right. Peruvian Bill, Roberto Rios, welcome back to the show. How you doing, man?
Good, dude. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be on and chat again. It's been a while.
Yeah, I am too. I guess since the last time we spoke, both of us are, using our faces, right? We've both revealed ourselves. But yeah, man, I'm glad to have you back on. You've been continuing to plug away, just putting out really, really good content and kind of shifted a little bit from your market updates to more kind of mini docs, which are really well produced. So obviously we'll, kind of talk through the most recent one, but be sure to check out his new work because I really like it. I haven't seen anything like it before. Quick, easy to understand, very well produced. So highly recommend that, man. It's been really exciting to see you, grow and develop your career. It's cool stuff, man.
Thank you. I appreciate that, man. We're really pushing more into the mini doc style content for macro because I think that there's a huge market gap there. And that first video was more of a trial. So like, trust me, it'll get even better from here. Is just testing out the idea of the mini doc on the channel. But we may be even starting a new channel to put the mini docs on. So I'll let you know about that in a little bit, but like it'd probably be under the same name, either Peruvian Bull or maybe Lima Research. But I'm excited, man. There's a lot of cool topics we can cover and a lot of stuff that just doesn't get discussed much in the like legacy financial media that just needs to be discussed and understood in order for people to know how to navigate the system.
Well, and that format is so hot. I realize for the audience, this is the most annoying insider baseball thing possible to talk about, but that's never stopped me. YouTube loves viewer retention. So like long form content and mini docs, like they're on any subject, like whatever your interest is, there are admittedly really well produced, mini documentaries, and YouTube loves to promote that. So to your point about there being a gap in the market, as someone who watches very little financial media, I watched your stuff and was like, oh, this is this is good and interesting. But I didn't just have you come on here to glaze your content. In the most recent video you released, it had a provocative title, How the Fed Stole the American Dream. So it's a great title, instantly intrigued. But do you want to just kind of explain your motivation for this topic and maybe your thesis, if you could?
Sure, absolutely. So essentially, I guess I came to this idea after just observing, right, what I would say the disconnect between the expectations and perceptions about the economy and the reality, right? Especially as I'm technically a Zoomer. So I was born in 97 and, in the wake of coronavirus, but also just in general, like throughout the 2010s and 2020s, we've seen increasing economic stagnation and overall market malaise in terms of job opportunities, ability to earn money, especially for young men in the United States, and increasing outsourcing and basically, replacement of our, of Americans by foreigners in the marketplace. And so I was like, why is this happening? What's going on? What are the driving factors causing this? And of course, because at the time in 2010s, I was very libertarian. So I was studying the Fed. I was reading books, Creature from Jekyll Island, The Secrets of the Fed, like all these like deep dives into how the Fed works, how it operates, what it actually is designed to do. And I realized obviously over time that the Fed has been, quasi successful in basically monetizing most of the things that we would consider necessary for the American dream, right? So for example, a college education, the housing market, the Fed has bought $2.6 trillion in MBS since 2008, from 2008 to 2015. And then they bought another $2 to $3 trillion in 2020. And so all that credit and capital.
Aside, I know what you mean when you say MBS, the audience might not.
Sure. MBS, mortgage-backed securities. So essentially what investment banks and loan originators can do is they can lend to people and then they can bundle those loans into securities, securitize them, get them rated by a ratings agency, and then sell them to investors. So pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, Wall Street investment houses, like anybody they want. And of course, if you watch The Big Short, like you understand like how big of an issue that was in 2008. But the Fed essentially, saw that issue and was like, we're going to basically run QE and asset swaps in order to absorb the excess MBS. And the problem is they just didn't stop this process. And so over the last 15 years, there's been $5 trillion of direct support for the housing market and another $3 to $4 trillion of indirect support, which has caused housing prices to explode, which means, guys like you and me, like late 20s, even guys early 30s, it's increasingly difficult to buy a home. And so that leads to economic despair, that leads to like psychological despair because you feel like, for one, the jobs are leaving, right? America's been deindustrialized. The tech jobs are being outsourced. There's inflation that's raging, that's eroding whatever real earnings you can make, even at your, wage cut job. And then now the housing prices are going bananas. And if you have a wife or you have a girlfriend or whatever, and you want to move in and start a family, you can't do that. And so that's why I say that title, like the Fed stole the American dream.
Yeah, there are several things there. One of my favorite people to talk about this is Dan Tubbs over at the Lotus Eaters. Brokenomics is his series. And it's perhaps more explicit in the British or the European context because they have a much more, it's much easier to map the sort of generational element of this because they have like a literal national health service. They have a literal pension fund. Right? It's clear. But he describes very much how all of that financialization you're talking about, taking a home from being a place you live to a financial asset, taking education from being, sort of vocational training again to a pillar of the economy is effectively ways to stave off the collapse of the social services pyramid scheme. So his argument is whether you look at Britain's NHS, our social security system, these were put in place in a time in which we had a true population pyramid. There were a large number of workers for a relatively small number of old people. People died more, they died sooner, they had more children. And so you had a large base of workers supporting a relatively few amount of, pensioners or the disabled. And as that population pyramid turned into a candle, and then in the case of some countries inverted, all of a sudden you have fewer and fewer people supporting directly. And so when we look at that, there are a couple things. Well, one, there's the direct, like the taxation element of it. And obviously we understand that taxation isn't just literally the check you write to the IRS every year, right? There's multiple layers of taxation. But also, I mean, whether you even just look at inflation as sort of a tax, but that's, an autistic libertarian argument. But similarly, you have the need for supplementary income. So you have Social Security, but also people need more money to live on. And so all of a sudden, if you have been saving, well, you need to beat out inflation. So all of a sudden, where do you put your 401k, for example? Well, that goes into the market where it is passively managed. And so now you have an immense cash infusion over the course of a generation into the market, which I'm sure, as you know, not a lot of normal people owned stocks before really the last 50 to 60 years. It's a relatively recent innovation. But then again, you have something like a home where all of a sudden, if you have a large number of old people sticking around, the utility of having a house that is a retirement asset, it is no longer a place to live. You see why that is sort of a necessary evil. And I realize, look, when we talk about boomers, it's easy to kind of slip into some kind of cheap political analysis, but there is a very real generational aspect to this. And obviously, look, like the millennials got screwed. No one's going to argue against that. Gen Z got really screwed. And just as an example, how many jobs have you applied to, like after you graduated college, do you think?
I mean, hundreds probably.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. Both of us are probably in the hundreds. And it is not just you and I. It is almost everyone I talk to has applied for hundreds of jobs. And look, part of the reason I think you and I are both making videos on the internet is that the job market is grim, right? Even for someone who has trading work experience, GPA above a certain target, it's like at a certain point, it feels as if not only is not only are you being taxed, the price of assets very high, but your ability to see if you can even start earning a decent income is sort of degraded. So sorry, Roberto, I just threw a bunch at you there. As you can tell, I went on a little bit of a rant, but anything you want to pull from that, you can.
Sure. Yeah, no, so again, what I would say is this is the problem with not only like the traditional analysis, but also I could say like the boomers perception of the situation. And again, it's not really something to blame them as much for. It's just to understand, like, they grew up in a time when, and by the way, my dad's a boomer, right? He's full dyed in the wool, like born in like small town Utah in 1951. Like, there's 3 channels for the news for his entire life. And so when I talk to my dad about anything that's not like basically like the TradCon talking points, he like, it blows his mind. He can't understand it, especially if I take, obviously bring up anything about either the wealth divide between the generations or even like the Israel-Palestine conflict, anything like that. It just doesn't compute for him because he can't fathom a world in which the authorities are lying. And I've had to, especially on the economic sphere, I've had to increasingly come to the conclusion that our economic statistics are becoming increasingly manipulated, right? So, I mean, just for example, the CPI since 1995, so about 30 years, there have been about 18 what they call hedonic adjustments to the CPI. A hedonic adjustment means that they're changing what's in the basket. So, and that they're doing this supposedly for keeping up to pace with what the modern consumer is buying. But in effect, what they do is they're changing the composition so that the inflation rate isn't as high as it would otherwise be. And so you can see this on sites like Shadow Stats.
A brief aside, why this? So the CPI Consumer Price Index is sort of I guess you could say like a convenient way to talk about inflation, not just of currency, but also in sort of cost of living. And the phrase you say, basket of goods, is what you will get in like 100 level business class, because it is just sort of national averages for a couple different things put together. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine, right, there's some staple like food goods, energy, whatever. And so ideally, if that were one constant collection of products, if it were growing at a certain rate, you could measure one year to another and it's an apples to apples comparison. But effectively, if you have in the course of, 30 years plus or minus changed it 18 times, it's a stupid comparison. It's impossible to compare from one year to another. But sorry, just wanted to provide some context on that. Yeah.
I'll keep it really basic, but like that's just one example. Right. And again, like once you start going down this rabbit hole, especially obviously like the libertarians bang this drum all day, which they're not wrong about it. Right. This is part of the issues that the government stats have become increasingly opaque and increasingly disconnected from reality. And so that's meant that like the CPI is underreported. The unemployment figures have been systemically underreported, especially since 2008. And even the GDP figures, right? Like you use the logic of how to calculate real GDP. And if you undercount inflation, de facto, you're overcounting GDP, because GDP is the way it's calculated is it's a nominal figure and then they discount it for inflation. And so let's say like nominal GDP grows 5% in a year, but let's say 4% of that is from inflation. But let's say you manipulate inflation so that's only 2.5%. Well, then you're going to claim that there's 2.5% real growth, right? The 5% nominal minus the 2.5%. But in reality, there's only 1% real growth. And so for the last, 15 years, especially since 2008, that's when all this manipulation became more and more apparent, right? As we entered this kind of, you'd say like post-collapse order, they decided to become increasingly brazen with these moves. And that's meant that although like the boomers are on financial TV, CNBC, all telling everybody, hey guys, like the unemployment numbers are low. What are you talking about? Why are young American men also triggered about the job market? Why are they claiming that it's so hard to get a job? Why are they claiming about the the real wages being so low. That's not true. Look at these, nominal wage figures discounted for inflation. They're this. And I'm like, well, because they've completely manipulated and changed how things are calculated. Like, again, if there's 18 hedonic adjustments in 30 years, that's basically every 2 years, right? So that means every 24 months, roughly, they're changing a little more often than that, like say every 22 months, they're changing what's in the basket. And not only that, they're also adding just as an example, like the new iPhones, when iPhones went from 1 camera to 2 on the backside, the econometricians and the statisticians at the Fed said, well, that's a quality improvement in the phone, and we're going to discount the phone by $250. And so even though this phone sold for a similar price, or even like $100 more, they discounted the price of the phone by $250. And so then they said, look, technology got cheaper, even though in effect it was more of a quality improvement or a better camera improvement rather than an actual price drawdown. So they do things like that to manipulate it. And that means that, again, the economy that the boomers and other, you could call it establishment trust bros believe exists, and the environment that actually exists according to real world experience, anecdotal experience from the Zoomers, are two completely different worlds.
Yeah. And I mean, the CPI is a great example. The other one that springs to mind is, do you remember when we redefined what the word recession meant during the Biden presidency?
Yeah.
Like a very brief amount of time. And I was in school. I think it was in my last year when that happened. I can't remember. But point is, I remember feeling like, wait a minute, I've got the textbook here. I'm not crazy. I've got a physical copy of what this is supposed to mean. But there was enough political pressure to make that not the real quote unquote definition anymore. And so you see that happening, you're like, okay, surely they've never done that before. And then you dig not even a full layer down, like you scratch the surface and you're like, oh, wait a minute. This is all of these numbers have been cooked. And even, and I didn't follow this story super closely, but even the Trump administration, has been, guilty of this as well with, job creation numbers, saying, oh, we created all these jobs, and then kind of hush hush revising the numbers later, after it's hit the headlines.
Yeah, and that's that also isn't fully their fault, right? Because again, what's happened is those jobs numbers were estimated during previous years, and then they have to go back and revise them because they realize those aren't real creations. And the problem is the cat's already out of the bag in some ways, right? Like the figures already have been manipulated so much lower. If Trump were to come out and say, "Hey guys, real unemployment's actually at 15, and it's been at 15 since 2008," that would shock everybody. That would send tremors to the markets. That would cause investors to lose confidence in the U.S. That would cause obviously a mass hysteria in the financial media. So what are his options realistically? Even if he knows that this has been swept under the rug, he can't really reveal it without hurting America. And all for what? To make some libertarians happy? He wouldn't really care about that. So strategically, it doesn't make sense if you're at the helm of power to do anything about it.
Oh, 100%. It's completely understandable, right? Given the constraints placed on him. So one of the things that you spoke about in that documentary is the way that workers used to live, right? That normal people used to live. Because if you talk to, and I don't want to just paint the Chicago school guys, but let's just say guys, people downstream of that, sort of normal conservatives who have, a little bit of, Milton Friedman, maybe a little bit of Hayek, maybe, but they will oftentimes talk about how this sort of Whig version of history, things are always getting better. The line is going up. Look at how cheap a TV is. And look, at least some of that is partially true, right? I have air conditioning. I probably wouldn't have had that, a few decades ago. I kind of like having air conditioning. But at the same time, when the basic building blocks of being a sort of normal, responsible citizen, the ability to live by yourself, to support yourself and a family, when those are out of reach, it's like, well, okay, regardless of what the big number says, this doesn't matter. So I guess not wanting to turn this into we must return with the V, like everything was better. What how did a normal American worker live? Shall let's just say even in 1950 or in 1900, right? What was considered normal?
Sure. I mean, there's a huge change, obviously, from 1900 to 1950, and even from like 1800 to 1900, because that century was the greatest century of economic growth ever seen in world history up until that point. Right, the U.S. created more wealth in 100 years than all other previous empires had in thousands of years, and so that was kind of like an economic singularity, right? And I think that was due to a confluence of factors. It was due to America having independence and being relatively isolated on the world stage, not getting caught up in the Napoleonic Wars, being able to just kind of like innovate and industrialize on its own without any serious pressure or stress from an external power. And also obviously like our location and our geography, there's more navigable rivers, for example, in the US than all other countries in the world. And so that means that the U.S. in general, like farmers can ship their goods much more easily, much more cheaply to other countries and around the world than other countries can. So that just makes us more competitive, and that just makes us better. And of course, we actually utilized that. We actually were able to take advantage of that because other continents and countries, even given the same natural resources, weren't able to do that. So I'm not going to discount the work of obviously the American settler and the colonists, but we were given obviously a great country to work with. The difference is since 1950, an average American in 2.2 years could afford a home. The median salary was $2,500 a year. The median home was like $5,000 a year, $6,000 a year. So a couple of years of work, you could get there. A college tuition was essentially like just a summer job. So you could work at a local diner, you could work bussing tables, you could work washing cars, and within a summer you could pay for most regional colleges. The one exception might be like the Ivy Leagues, where you would still need to take a little bit of loans or to get some financial aid. But other than that, it was very, very, very affordable, right? And so for the median American that was born in like let's say Youngstown, Ohio, or Chicago, Illinois, like they were able to just buy a home, support a family, and do everything on a single income. And that was kind of a golden age for American capitalism and consumerism in general. But that meant that those people could build families and could create a legacy very easily without the barriers that we have today. Because what's happened, again, because the Fed has had to respond to like recurring financial crises over the past 60, 70 years, is they've had to expand their power and their ability to monetize different assets. And then, so like, that means that, like what we said, stocks have become overvalued, real estate's become overvalued, college tuition, which is you could say like is indirectly supported by the Fed because the Fed buys government bonds, does QE. The government sends all these grants to all these universities to teach people how to do, lesbian basket weaving or whatever, and then that just drives up the costs for normal people, right? There's no disconnection between, you could say like the financialized economy and the real one, whereas there should be in most like advanced societies.
Yeah, well, and to your point about education as well, and some of this gets into social policy, with decisions like, Griggs v. Duke, basically saying that your employers are sort of limited in what they can require of an applicant. I'll leave it at that. No need to get more specific. So there's sort of a need to offload that to the higher education system. And also, let's be honest, higher education is a massive job program for government sinecures. Like if you are Joe Biden's top guy, let's be honest, you probably work in a university, at least lots of people who do, right? Mm-hmm. It is a massive, look, even at my school, right, there were, just as many administrators as professors, right? Mm-hmm. Dozens of people who don't really add anything to the economy, but they've got a cushy job. It is useful for power to keep them around, right? Yeah. Which again balloons that cost. And so you sort of have this like self-licking ice cream cone where like the costs ever balloon up, which necessitates more federal involvement, which necessitates on the back end, like more bureaucrats and managers. So it is this kind of like ever increasing system. Brief aside, oftentimes when you talk to older people or boomers, when you bring up criticisms like these, you'll get something like, oh, you're just complaining, things were hard before. And look, that's true. Work culture has changed a lot. What is expected has changed a lot. And that doesn't mean that, if you could make these sort of structural changes, everyone would be a success. But it is to say that fundamentally, and your point about even just how many years it would take the average worker to afford the average home, you can see that, okay, let's say it was 2.5 years, right? We'll go with that.
2.5 years.
So, okay, maybe you can't buy it in cash, but you put money away, you live responsibly. That's something that can be done. Even if your down payment is only half, right? But still, like that's hard to do, but it can be done. Whereas if it's 10x, right? Or if it's 8x, I can't remember exactly what it is now. That is significantly harder to do. And so you're pushing things like, the median age of your first home back from being something that you could do relatively soon after leaving your parents' house to something that you might not do until you're almost middle-aged. And again, with every one of these things, we see that, what were considered basic building blocks, like sort of the parts of life, are now late in life luxuries. A great example of this, and not that it matters to everyone, is cars, right? So it used to be that the adjusted price of a new car, like you could buy, a pretty sweet car for like 15 grand, equivalent price, brand new. And so look, like, should you be buying, brand new cars? Was technically more economically advantageous to find something nice and used? Yeah, probably. But also, that was something that a lot of people could swing. I own a used car I bought for 15 grand, right? And that's like one of those little ways, both to say the growth in cost of living, but also the relative decrease in quality of living, right? Where now you are paying the exact same for something that, is significantly worse at best, or paying a lot more money for the same thing. And so to your point about inflation, it's like, well, like, how do you measure that? Right? Okay, sure, there's a cumulative inflation rate, but when we're talking about that decreased quality of life, it's harder to put a number on it. So anyway, sorry, that was a rant there, Roberto. I'll throw it back to you.
Dude, you had a lot of good points there. I mean, I'll want to hit on a couple. First, you said, you mentioned the increasing, like I would say, even feminization of academia, right? And government in general. And that's been part of the issue, is the move towards the welfare state, the move towards sending money to unproductive people at the expense of productive people has been, I think, obviously a drag on our economy and our market in general, because what you're doing essentially is you're giving people like academics, or especially administrators, managerial, people, the power and the ability to earn outsized amounts of money to do essentially nothing. Right. I mean, I was an RA at my university, resident assistant, and I had to take DEI trainings. I had to take like the slew of like economic and political indoctrination. And all the managers that were like administering this stuff did essentially nothing. Like I remember there were days I'd go into their office on like Monday at 2 p.m. and there was no one there. And I was like, man, this is insane. Like my tax dollars are paying for this. And right now I'm benefiting from it because I have scholarships and I have student loans. But, when I'm an adult and have a family, I don't want to be paying taxes for this lady to just sit on her ass all day and not do anything. And this is happening all across America. I think John Carter has I think it was John Carter that put a really good thread together about the feminization of academia. And in that, he like laid out this exact problem of, how as you move towards a more managerial based economy, an administrative based economy, where you're, instead of trying to optimize for growth and everyone has to service their own needs, you throw the responsibility back on the system. So you absolve people of personal responsibility and make it more the administrator's responsibility to take care of people's needs, or the system, or the general empathy of the people to do things for the individuals, which destroys, right, individual responsibility and ability to move and operate autonomously. So yeah, it's just it's created again. It's not just the raw numbers that are the issue. Obviously, like it used to take 2.5 years to buy a home at the median salary. Now it's 8 to 10, right? It used to be 6 months of work to pay for a college tuition. Now it's like 4 or 5 years potentially of work to pay for the college of a full semester at like the highest end of colleges. It used to be, you used to earn essentially like a 5% real wage growth from 1950 to 1960, 5% compounding real wage growth, and increasing productivity year over year. And now the real wage growth is basically nothing, and the productivity is still growing because of technology advancements, but that only obviously has so much to go. So you're basically seeing this disconnection between salary workers and the wealthy elites who already own all the assets. So when the Fed is doing all these programs, they're essentially helping the people who already own the assets. 84% of all US stocks are owned by the top 10%. So when the Fed does these QE programs and the Fed simulates markets, whether it's through like overt QE or like quiet QE, which if you like read monetary plumbing, you'll understand what that is. It's stimulating their portfolios, not necessarily like the layman. To your point, like the average boomer, 70% of his wealth is in real estate, not stocks. And the average person, the median American, only has a few $1,000s worth of stocks, not tens of or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And something like, what is it, 50% of Americans can't come up with $1,000 on a moment's notice. Like this economic strain and malaise has just propagated itself and gotten worse and worse and worse throughout the years. And there's so many different contingent factors, but really I would say the managerial economy, like the feminization of the entire system, and also obviously like the Fed and their ability to manipulate interest rates and credit and liquidity in order to save the key players that they deem are essential for the system.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, right? Who they deem are essential. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite things to do is sort of to go back to like out of date cultural commentary, like really out of date. Like I'm talking like George Bush era. Like what mm-hmm. were good progressive people talking about at the time? And it's so funny to me to hear, many of the same people now who are, just locked in with the regime. Like they love everything that's going on, railing against like the big bank bailouts. And they're not wrong, but it's interesting to see for so many people that talking point, that opposition was simply kind of a convenient political thing. Right? It was simply a way to like, I'm angry at this guy. Here's the stick I'm going to use to hit him. And what's especially interesting to me is someone who doesn't really operate in kind of like the economic space. Like it's not my wheelhouse. It's not what I'm reading every day. But it seems as if for a long time, the argument has been like, things can't keep going on like this. This doesn't mm-hmm. make sense. Mm-hmm. And that is still the argument you hear. But it seems as if now it is not only very close, but also it's like, well, what does an economy look like if you have basically everyone under 30 or 35 completely locked out? Like, is that even an economy anymore? Because one of the things that I think about is that you mentioned that, for the average boomer, 70% of their
net worth,
of their wealth,
net worth is in the house. Yeah.
Is in the house. Well, eventually that needs to be cashed out, right? Eventually the pension, the 401k, whatever, needs to be cashed out. And so if you have these massively overvalued assets that in order to be used need to be sold or disposed of, where does that go? Because I'm not an expert, but it seems as if I know where that goes.
Yeah, Stormy's thesis is that we're going to see a massive housing correction in the next few years because of this transfer of wealth. And I mean, I think there's a lot of credence to that argument because, there's 10,000 boomers retiring a day. Their generation in total size is between 86 and 88 million. And a large portion of them own homes. Actually, super majority, like over 70 or 80% own a home. So that means that you have potentially 60 million homes coming on the market in the next 20 years. And, some of these homes obviously will be granted to their kids in the form of like a gift or estate tax transaction. But there's also going to be a lot of boomers who essentially don't want to give anything to their kids. And I've seen that sentiment shared online quite common. There's been a couple studies that they've done, even online polls, where they found that the boomers were the least likely generation to leave their assets to their kids between Gen X, millennials, and boomers. Something like 30% of them said they wanted to leave their kid with nothing and just trust that their kid can do everything themselves, right, and build themselves up from nothing. And I think it depends on which state you're in, but what will happen to those houses is, I guess you'd sell them and either give the money to charity, or the government could potentially seize the assets in certain conditions. But it just means that like our economy has again become increasingly disjointed and tilted towards that section of the populace that actually isn't even producing anything. And it's not to say that they're not, good people, they're not worthwhile people, but Woe shared this the other day, right? Like there are more home buyers over the age of 70 now than under 35. And the median age of a new home buyer is now 39. In 1950, it was 23. And the median new home buyer had a wife. So it was a new young first married couple, or freshly married couple that was moving into their first home. And with 2.5 years of work, the guy could buy the house with cash outright. So just a few years of living at home, working a good job, not even a college education required, and you could buy a house and you could move in with your wife and start a family, and everything would be fine. And now that that reality is now slipped away from us basically completely. So again, the hope is that the boomers selling will make us go back to a more reasonable housing price. But dude, I think the Fed has to ease no matter what. Like the system demands liquidity. And so that just means that housing prices will have to go up, SPY will have to go up, everything will have to go up forever, because they just need more cash injected into the system.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because oftentimes, especially conservative people of that generation, still talk as if they are the economic engine that drives the world. Mm-hmm. And that may have been true, is certainly not now. Like, look, like you don't technically live on welfare, but let's be honest, you kind of live on welfare, right? Like, not to be rude, but it's pretty close to that. And it creates the same way to letting people who either work for the government, have their jobs depend on government largesse, or just straight up get an EBT. It creates a massive distortion, right? Creates a massive perverse incentive. So for instance, I'm not sure if you followed this, DeSantis in Florida, which is a it's a quite old, quite conservative state. He's been going on about, we need to, decrease, the amount of property taxes people are facing, basically multiple of these sort of pushes to basically disadvantage the rest of the economy at the expense of older people with homes. And look, I get it. It sucks to be, someone who bought their house and they're still paying an exorbitant property tax. I have my property tax bill next to me. I'm avoiding paying it because it's really big and I don't want to. So I get that. But at the same time, what I'm identifying is that especially when you have a generation like the boomers that is very, very large, it creates a massive distortion. And we saw this over COVID, where effectively the whole world was run for the benefit of old people, right? Keeping old people alive. And I'm not saying that old people should die or they should be inconvenienced, but fundamentally, if the point of your society is basically a nursing home, right? To keep people, between the ages of, 59 and 85 happy in as good health as they can be at the expense of everything else. It's like, that's a huge distortion. And that sort of dynamism that defined America in a previous era, it's like, well, it's no wonder that's gone, because that isn't the point of America anymore. America isn't a real country. It's a very large nursing home. And it's like, I'm sort of joking in the American context, but in places like the UK, it's much more explicit, right? That is a sort of a national health service with a flag attached to it. So sorry, I may have been a little bit too theoretical, but do you see what I'm saying about the distortion of having such a large, wealthy group of people being old and also the recipient of a massive amount of government services?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. It's a, again, it's a massive issue. It's that stat, right? More home buyers over the age of 70 than under the age of 35. It shows that the economy has become completely, I guess you could say, like tilted or unbalanced towards the boomers and their political power. And again, part of that is obviously because of their wealth, but also because of their I guess you could say, like, in-group beliefs. They have the most trust in the system. They're the most likely to vote of any generation. They're the most likely to campaign. You see all those, like, I mean, I live in Pacific Northwest. I live near Seattle, and I see boomers all the time doing protests and organizing events, usually against Trump, because this is like a very left-wing state, especially in the West side of it. And those events are turning out like hundreds or even in some cases thousands of boomers, whereas they're not turning out even any young left-wing people. And so that's kind of funny that it tells me that they, to their credit, they are more politically organized as a bloc than any other generation in American history. And they're willing to fight for what they want, right? Which is their Social Security benefits, their Medicare, Medicaid, lower property taxes. But it's problematic because the nation exists for the furtherance of the people, and in order to do that, you need to prioritize the young, right? I'm not saying at all costs, but if you're a father, for example, and you have kids, you would rightfully, if you were running out of food, you'd prioritize your kids' food over your own. And this is the opposite situation where you're prioritizing the old, decrepit people over the young, and that's destroying the birth rate. That's destroying innovation. That's destroying the ability to innovate and to continue to stimulate growth. I mean, this is what Japan is facing, right? Like last year they had 900,000 people die in excess of their birth rate. So they're losing almost 1 million people a year now. And the fertility problem is much more complex than just economics. And I grant that, like, it's not just, make housing cheaper and that will fix fertility, or, make it so young men can earn more money, therefore that'll fix all the fertility or the marriage problems. That's not it. Obviously, there's like a very strong social component there. But if you do not fix this, your society begins to die. And it's a slow death. And it's such a miserable way to die too, because it's completely avoidable.
Yeah, and I think that's important to state that, like, it is not as simple as, it's not a univariate problem, right? It is not simply that it is too expensive to pair off, but also that's a huge part of it. You're adding additional drag to the system. And if it is already very difficult to get modern people to reproduce and have children, it's like, well, even if any one thing isn't the silver bullet, you'd ideally want to make it as easy and, as possible. And I think that this is one of those things as well. I notice that when people talk about immigration, I think that oftentimes they miss the actual economic goal of immigration, because there's sort of the wrapping on the outside of the box, which is like, we'll have 1 million brain surgeons or whatever, this will be perfect. But another like much grosser way to look at it is that effectively this machine requires more people forever. And yeah, sure, you and I might understand that there's a quantitative difference between a guy from Michigan and a guy from Somalia who has been transported to Michigan. But in like big line go up number brain, where you were, completely monomaniacally focused on one measure, like, it's no shock that we see this sort of level of replacement migration. And I go back to the UK because it's sort of they have in my mind, a more advanced version of the problem we have, right? So for instance, they're kicking off a sovereign debt crisis. We aren't quite there yet.
Yeah.
Their birth rate is, a tick worse than ours. Sort of every problem we are facing, they're hitting it a little bit quicker. But you see the same thing where it is effectively there is very, very low birth rate. And in order to balance that population pyramid, the idea is simply to import, I guess the demographic term would be fecund. It's sort of gross sounding, but people from, the third world, with the idea that way we can supercharge the birth rate and make this machine somehow make sense. And very clearly that is not working.
Yeah. I think part of the problem is this maniacal focus on GDP, which I've been excoriating GDP on my Twitter. I've gotten some shit for it, but I've talked to Stormy about it, and and other smart people, and they all agree this. It's insane that we're using this measure that counts government spending and private sector spending as equally valuable in the economy, and also a measure, obviously, that, like we said, is manipulatable, right? You can easily grow GDP nominally, undercount inflation, and then real GDP will de facto go up, even though the actual GDP numbers aren't as good as it seems. And the point of a country is not to have infinite GDP growth forever. The point of a country is not to have infinite stock growth forever. The point of the country is not, Tesla and Nvidia can be both worth $5 trillion in market cap each, right? The point is for the furtherance of the people and the progression of the society as a whole. And when you bring in workers like that and just focus on the bottom line, you're completely destroying the ability of the native people, right, of the actual British Anglo-Saxons to have homes, to have jobs, to compete for labor or even for business contracts, because now you have suddenly a new source of labor that's way cheaper than you could ever be. And that just obviously is almost like you could say like a silent killer of millions of people. Right. I mean, look at the second and third order effects. Okay. Drug overdose deaths. And that's something I touched on in the video. There were, 1 million excess deaths from drug overdoses and what the CDC calls deaths of despair from 2000 to 2025. And that means in those 25 years, we lost more people from drug overdoses. And these are, mainly Americans, I would say isolated to Midwest, Rust Belt states, the states that were deindustrialized the most, from drug overdoses than we did in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, right? So essentially, we've had 2 wars fought in our country to kill lower middle class Americans for the last 25 years, and nobody has done anything about it. Nobody's cared. Nobody's taken these people to account. Nobody has, the Sackler family has just gotten slaps on the wrist, but it's just completely hollowed out large swaths of America, and it's endemic of this larger issue that we have.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up when we were discussing education, the managerial aspect of it. Because when we talk about managerialism, well, what is that? Burnham's The Managerial Revolution is quite good. It's a bit dry, but he talks about writing in the interwar years, the death of capitalism. And he has this point where he basically says, show me a capitalist. You go, a few decades before he wrote this, you went to the top of Ford Motor Company. There was a guy named Ford there. It was his. He ran it like a king. Skip forward, a few decades, and yeah, sure, there's a guy named Ford who sits on the board of directors, but can he just walk in one day and say, all right, we're only doing this, or we're only doing that? No. And he talks about the growth of several things there, which is the dispersal of ownership through, joint stock. That basically no one person owns anything anymore once a business gets to a certain size. Obviously, there are exceptions. I am speaking in broad terms about a book that I read 4 years ago, so I might have missed some details. But that creates the need for managers, people who run something but don't own it. So as we've said, talking about, power, right? When we look at Trump in the Oval Office, he's sort of a manager, right? When he's done, he goes home after his 4 years. He goes back to Mar-a-Lago and plays golf. He doesn't really, I'm sure he does, but you know what I mean? From a strict rational perspective, why would it matter to him if the ticking time bomb that is, the distortion of economic data blows up because, well, he isn't the guy there. It'll be another manager. It'll be the next CEO. if you will. And similarly, right, if we look at those managers, their instinct is, to be honest, their own self-preservation, not the health of the organization whatsoever. They're also hyper-focused on, like, we would say the business world, like
KPIs, yeah.
Yeah, key performance indicators. And so you create this system where it's like, okay, well, how can I justify my job? Was like a DEI consultant. Like I guarantee you after that course, you probably had to take some stupid survey with like 5 values, like very helpful, not very helpful, all that kind of stuff. And it's goofy and it's stupid, but that is how that person justifies their job. Or in the case of, being the sort of person who Fed chair, sorry, I got that backwards, right? We have these variables where it's GDP. That is the thing that determines if this is going well or not, because it's simple. You can put it on a chart. And I think that the problem with, dispersing ownership, with dispersing responsibility, authority, whatever you want to say, is it creates the need for these highly abstract concepts that may have started as a convenient way to talk about something like the general economic health of a nation, but have grown so far apart that it's almost completely inconsequential to the effect, or as far as it concerns actually living in the economy.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Like when GDP was first formulated, right, I guess it was a good rough approximation of economic health. And as we've continued down this path towards managerialism, the Bernanke put, the Greenspan put, more and more financialization of everything, of homes, of student loans, of cars and auto loans, and even buy now pay later schemes, right? Like we've moved towards this GDP maximizing managerial state. And I got into an argument. This is maybe my fault for continually fighting with people on Twitter, which is retarded because most people like have room temperature IQ, so it's like impossible to explain stuff to them. But I was talking to one guy who was saying like, no, GDP going up is by definition a net good for everybody in the society. And I was like, okay, well, so if we expanded America's borders to include all of the third world, our GDP would go up. Do you want to do that? He's like, yeah, why not? And I was like, but do you understand that GDP per capita would collapse? And do you understand why that's bad? And even using the flawed GDP measure. And if you use other better measures like worker productivity, like inventions per 1,000 people, if you use those metrics in, expanding the American border all the way to like, let's say Bolivia would be a huge net detriment to the United States. Even though GDP would nominally go up because now you have another 500 million Latin Americans, involved in your economy. And I say this like lovingly, right? I have family in Argentina. I have family that my mom's side of the family is Spanish, Italian, and most of them live in South America. And they're great people, but that doesn't mean that including them in our economy is the best idea. And so, just because the GDP goes up doesn't mean on net it's best for everybody. And that argument is very hard to grasp, especially for the academics and the statisticians and the econometricians at the Fed who only look at these numbers, and especially even like the manipulated ones. And so that, again, it's ridiculous because I need to stop getting into those fights because they just will not concede on any of those points. But that's the reality.
Well, complete sidebar, not related to the economy in the slightest. I've basically, actually, literally, other than announcements of content, given up posting on Twitter. My life is so much better. Like I've not missed out on anything. There's no point where I was like, wow, I really wish I was on Twitter. That moment never happened. But dude, we are fast coming up on time. This is a fascinating discussion. I'd love to have you back on. If people want to find you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So I have a Substack called Dollar Endgame. I also post on Twitter, obviously. If you look up Roberto Rios or Peruvian Bull, and my YouTube channel is Peruvian Bull. And I will be, like I said, we're going to be switching to more documentary style videos. So hopefully much more content coming on that soon.
Definitely. All of that will be linked down in the description. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. This is what I do now. If you want to support me, you're going to have to throw me a few bucks. You can do that on Patreon, Subscribestar, Substack, and Gumroad. Benefit for that is you get the episodes early and ad-free. So be sure to check that out. Our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. Roberto, this was a ton of fun, man. It was great having you on. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.